Hi guys and welcome to the channel. My name is Nick O'Leary. Now today we're going through a thing called Dynamic Select. Now Dynamic Select is basically the drive mode found in your Mercedes-Benz. And more specifically in this episode we're covering what Dynamic Select does in a petrol or diesel model. Now I will be covering a couple of extra videos in the future on what Dynamic Select does on a plug-in hybrid and then also what it does on a battery electric vehicle, because they do differ slightly. But in this one, it's petrol and diesel. So first up, where is this Dynamic Select switch? Well, due to the many variation of Mercedes-Benz models, it can vary, but as a general rule of thumb, it's either going to be in one of two places. So first, it should be in the top left-hand corner of your center console, and it will have a toggle switch that you can move up or down and cycle through these different modes. Alternatively, it's going to be next to your hazard switch, featuring a button to cycle through those different modes. Now, as a general rule of thumb, you'll find usually, and quite commonly, you'll have Eco, Comfort, Sport, and sometimes Sport Plus. Now, if you're lucky enough to have a Mercedes AMG vehicle, then you may find a couple of these have been swapped out for the words slippery and sometimes the words race. So these two are unique to Mercedes AMG vehicles. And if you have an SUV, then you may find you've got an off-road mode as well. Now, all modern Mercedes will start up in their default mode, which is Comfort. However, after starting, you can change this to whatever you like. So, what are they like on the road? So Comfort, that default mode, is going to give you pretty much all the power available from the engine, but most importantly, it's going to change through the gears as smoothly as possible, giving you that Mercedes-Benz experience that you'd expect. So, what's it like on other modes? Well, if we go down a mode, for example, to Eco, what this one does is reduce the amount of power available from the engine. So you have less power now, but your fuel consumption will of course go down a bit. So your MPG will potentially go up as well, depending on the driving conditions at the time. But there is a very unique thing with Eco. So apart from the usual thing of less power from the engine and changing gear as quickly as possible, it will also use a thing called gliding mode. Now, gliding mode is quite clever actually. So when you're driving down the road, if there aren't any cars in front of you, so you've got the open road and you're accelerating around about 70 miles an hour and you take your foot off of the accelerator, it'll actually take the car out of gear and almost act like the car's in neutral. So you're then coasting down the road. So all that momentum you've used to get going up to that speed, you're now just kind of freewheeling down the road. Now, as soon as you go for the accelerator pedal or brake pedal, it will pop back into gear and then you'll be good to go again. Eco is also quite useful just in case it's a little bit frosty or cold outside. Because of that reduced power, sometimes with cold temperatures you can have less traction, so it is quite useful in those conditions, or maybe even really torrential rain or something like that, just to kind of reduce that power so you've got more grip. Now, when it comes to Sport mode, however, Sport mode does the opposite. So what this is going to do is give you more power from the engine, and you'll also find the accelerator pedal is going to be a little bit more responsive. Now, also as a subsequent result, you'll also see that the revs are held slightly higher than normal. So this will kind of be more useful for someone who might want to drive in a sportier manner. Now, I don't really use the term boy racing or anything like that. I like the term spirited driving. But, however, it's obviously going to give you that more power and be a lot more responsive than the previous two modes that we just mentioned. So, what's the difference between Sport and Sport Plus, if you have it? Well, Sport Plus is just a more extreme version of this. So, you have ESP on all of these, but you'll find that the car will hold the revs even higher and have even more power. Now, the Sport modes and Sport Plus modes are very useful for overtaking, or just in case you need to get up to a certain speed really quickly. Now, as you go through these modes as well, you'll also find that the steering weight will also get just a little bit heavier to kind of aid that sporty driving style. So those are the differences really between these modes. Now, there's also a mode called Individual. Now, Individual lets you make your own custom mode. Now, depending on your specification on your car, you can actually see on the screen when you move the dynamic select switch what you can customize. So if I move back onto individual again, I can see literally here I can change the engine and gearbox, and then I can also change the steering weight. So this individual mode is quite useful, say you liked the kind of sportiness drive of Sport Plus maybe, but you didn't want the steering weight any heavier, so you can adjust this and tailor it to your preference. Now also, depending on your specification as well, if you have air suspension or an adjustable dampening system for your suspension, then you can also adjust this in here as well. It is quite rare to find in the UK, but if you do have it, then you can of course adjust that on there. Now, if you're lucky enough to have a Mercedes AMG vehicle, as I mentioned earlier, you may find that a couple of these modes may have been swapped out for slippery and race. Now, what slippery does is kind of what it says on the tin, but what it will do is reduce the amount of power available from the engine, because typically with a Mercedes AMG engine, they are very, very powerful and it is quite easy to spin those wheels. So slippery will reduce this power and give you as much traction as possible. And if you have 4MATIC, then it's going to make use of that even more to make sure you've got as much grip on the road as possible. Now, when it comes to the race mode, this is the opposite of that. So race mode officially and by the book should only be used on tracks. Basically, it's going to set the car up for as much power as that engine can give you, and if you have adaptable suspension, it's going to make that suspension as firm as possible to make sure your tyres are in contact with the road as much as possible. But that race mode, of course, does feature those race starts and launch controls, so they definitely do put a smile on your face. Oh, and of course, if you have the AMG Performance exhaust, if you use any other mode apart from Sport Plus and Race, it's going to sound like this. But then if you opt for the Sport Plus and Race mode, you'll find the exhaust will open up and it's going to sound like this. Now, if you've opted for an SUV in the Mercedes-Benz range, maybe like a GLE for example, there's also an option at factory for a thing called the Offroad package. Now, one of the main features of this is that it does give you some kind of underbody protection on the car, so a thing called an underguard. But also on Dynamic Select, you'll find there's an off-road mode. Now, officially, this should only be used off-road. You shouldn't use this on the public road. It's going to set the car up to give the car as much traction as possible in those extreme environments. So things maybe like some very high-dense mud or something, or a gravel track, or even rocky terrain. Anything like that is where you'd use the off-road mode. One extra thing it does, it will also raise the car up slightly higher, giving you some extra ground clearance. And there we go, guys, that concludes this week's video on Dynamic Select on your Mercedes-Benz petrol or diesel. Don't forget that like button if you liked what you saw, and don't forget that subscribe button if you want to see any more future videos just like this one. Thanks again for watching, we'll see you next week.